Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 588. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about beaches, sailboats, and South Pacific culture, croque monsieur pain au chocolat, and a little bit of France in the South Pacific as we go to New Caledonia.
Maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. We'll hear more from a sponsor coming up here, but first let's talk about New Caledonia. I'd like to welcome to the show CJ Johnson from the MOVIELAND podcast, who's come to talk to us about New Caledonia. CJ, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm very delighted to be on the show. I enjoy the podcast very much.
Well, and as a fellow podcaster, I appreciate that because you have some idea how much work this takes. So,
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to do mine through a government arts organisation, being the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC in Australia. So that makes all the studio stuff and everything very, very easy. But I do produce my entire show. So I arrange my guests, I do the interviews, I edit it, and then I pump it out there.
Excellent. So why are we talking about New Caledonia? What's your relationship to New Caledonia?
I went there very recently. I live in Sydney, Australia. And my father is from the island nation of Fiji. He grew up in Suva in Fiji. And so I've been to Fiji a bunch of times. And together as a father-son combo, we know the South Pacific quite well. We've been to some interesting places in the South Pacific, such as Tonga. He's also been to Vanuatu and Tahiti. I haven't been to those places. And there's a whole bunch of really interesting places in the South Pacific, and one of them is New Caledonia.
Well, let's put it on a map for those people who didn't grow up watching McHale's Navy and may not recognize New Caledonia.
It's about 1,000 miles east of Australia in the South Pacific. And indeed, from Sydney, where I live, it's actually quicker to fly to New Caledonia than it is to other parts of Australia. I mean, even though it's a different country and off the coast, it is closer to Sydney than, for example, far north Queensland, which is just the very next state to the state I live in. The reason we chose to go to New Caledonia when my little daughter had a school vacation recently was because my little daughter, who is 3.5 years old, is going to the French school here in Sydney. She is going to the Lycée Condorcet, which is the international French school in Sydney. I am a Francophile. I speak some pretty good French. It's not perfect and it's not fluent, but it's okay. And I wanted to give her the gift of French from as soon as she started going to school. So she would grow up bilingually learning English and French, and it would never be a hassle for her. It would never be an effort. She would just learn French alongside English easily. And so that's the gift I'm giving her by sending her to the French school. And so it just so happened that there is a part of France that is a 2-hour flight away from Sydney that is cheap and easy to get to in the South Pacific, that combines the kind of Fijian culture that we know from my father's backstory and France, because New Caledonia is France. And that's what's so interesting about it. Officially, it's part of the French unique collectivity. They don't use the word colony. It is part of the French unique collectivity, which basically means it is France. French laws, its head of state is Emmanuel Macron. It is a piece of France in the South Pacific. And that's what makes it truly unique.
Interesting.
So, for example, on the micro level, when you go into a cafe in the morning there, everything that you would expect on a French menu is what is being offered. There is the croque madame and the croque monsieur and the pain au chocolat and the coffees of the French style, and there are exceptional baguettes around, and everyone is speaking French. French is the language.
Excellent. And what kind of itinerary do you recommend for New Caledonia?
We went by boat, and so we were sleeping on a boat.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Out of Brisbane, or where do you go out of?
The boat was most recently in Brisbane, yes. That is the most direct sailing route from any populated part of Australia to New Caledonia is, yes, out of Brisbane. Now, you could sail there from Sydney. I don't know how long that would take. From Brisbane, it took 5 days.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, a little less, maybe. It depends on whether you go 24/7 or not, how you steam.
And which boat is this then?
This is my father's boat.
Okay. Okay. There's a couple small ship cruise lines that operate in that area, and so I thought we were talking about one of those. Got it. You were sailing there.
Yeah. Now, this is the interesting thing about the cruise lines is that one major cruise ship a day stops in New Caledonia. So for North American listeners who aren't likely to get on a plane and go all the way to the South Pacific to get their French on or to get their tropical on, one of the ways they might end up there is on a big cruise, is on a cruise that takes in parts of the Southern Hemisphere. And it's a pretty small main capital city, Noumea in New Caledonia. So it really can only accommodate one cruise ship a day. And so it does. And so every day a cruise ship arrives at the port there and people get out and walk around and get back on. And so that is its relationship to the cruise ships of the world. Unlike, big cities such as Sydney that might have 3 at dock at any one time, there's always just only one at Noumea.
Okay.
Its relationship to France is fascinating, but like many places, countries, plots of land that the French either colonized or put under their own protection in their history of colonization, it is a history of French settlers with the local people. And so there are local Malaysians who are known as Kanaks, and the Kanaks speak French and coexist alongside the French settlers. But it is, like many histories of colonization, an uneasy history. There was dominance, there was usurpation of power, there was killing, there was barbarity in its history. And so there is an interesting edge to the place between the people and among the people itself. And that edge is likely to continue. So part of the reason I wanted to mention New Caledonia now is it may not be as happy a place 18 months from now, because what is happening is that in 1991, it was declared at some point they have to have a referendum for independence, and we'll have it in 2018. That'll be ages away. Well, 2018 has come around. And so there is going to be a referendum for independence from France next year, and then that is allowed to be repeated twice if it doesn't get voted for. So basically stacking the deck in the favor of it getting voted for independence by giving it 3 shots. If it doesn't get a vote for independence after 3 times, I guess it stays under the control of France. If that vote for independence does not go through, there is likely to be resentment on the loyalist Kanak side. And if it goes through, there is likely to be great, when I say fear, not necessarily physical fear, but fear of deep uncertainty among all the descendants of the French settlers. So there could be some civil unrest. And indeed, over the last year or so, in the north of the country, where there is much fiercer Kanak loyalty and far less settler populations, there has been some bad unrest in the form of independence movement people taking gunshots at police. And I think 20 instances over the last year of police being shot at, and that meant France sent 53 more police officers there in October, I believe, of this year. Adding a force of 53 to a small country like this is significant. So there is an uneasiness there. And if you want to go there, I would suggest going there sooner rather than later. That all adds up to.
Okay. I wouldn't say you did the best job for the tourism board there of promoting the destination right now. So let's set that aside for a second and talk about then why we should go.
Well, because it's fascinating and gorgeous.
Okay.
The islands of the South Pacific are their own unique and wonderful thing.
Mm-hmm.
For the North American traveler who hasn't traveled to the South Pacific, the closest that they can imagine, I suppose, is Hawaii.
Sure.
And when you look at this ambience and atmosphere and aesthetic of Hawaii, the palm trees and the huge, abundantly lush mountains and volcanoes rolling down to beaches sometimes that encircle the islands and then to turquoise blue sea. That is the vibe that is throughout the South Pacific. Mm-hmm. And Fiji with its 301 islands, they're all dotted with palm trees and all sort of stick up out of the sea and roll down to immaculate beaches and turquoise blue waters. And likewise, these smaller countries such as New Caledonia and Vanuatu are very similar. So New Caledonia has that vibe. It's tropical. The weather is very, very warm and lovely. It is stunningly beautiful in terms of its water, the turquoise water, and all of those things that make islands so desirable. And yet it has this much more I don't want to use the word civilized because that is, I suppose, offensive to long-standing indigenous cultures that aren't as industrially developed. Mm-hmm. But it has this French level of infrastructure and money that's been poured into it. And so it does have roads and stop signs and building materials and air conditioning and Wi-Fi and cabling and electrical grids, etc., that are far, far superior to all of the island countries around it in the South Pacific. Mm-hmm. It has first world amenities on essentially an island that most of its neighbors have kind of second world facilities.
Okay.
So you can feel comfortable and get your Francophile vibe on and also be in the South Pacific. Because some island nations in the South Pacific, they require a more adventurous traveler. Do you know what I mean? Like Tonga, you need to be more adventurous than New Caledonia by a long stretch.
Let's take a break here and hear from our sponsor. This week's episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by Fragrance X. Fragrance X is America's largest fragrance outlet. They offer free shipping and up to 80% off brand name perfumes, which is a way better deal than you're going to get in the duty-free shop. And then you also don't have to go on the plane smelling like perfume. They also help you find discontinued perfumes, and I've had that problem at Christmas and Valentine's Day. For my wife, it was trying to track down a specific Halston fragrance, and for my mother, I can't even remember what it was that I went all over town looking for. So Fragrance X, you can also get 20% off using the code TRAVELER20 at fragrancex.com. Thanks again to Fragrance X for sponsoring this episode. So you started in the capital, and what do you recommend people do and see there, and then where do you go from there?
First of all is basically just tromp around the capital by foot. It's very, 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 very doable. The main town is a very, very interesting example of what a town can look like on a South Pacific island with this sort of level of infrastructure spending that comes from a huge, huge state like France, combined with the necessities of island living. Just the architecture and the way people live is interesting in terms of how the houses and the buildings are geared to take advantage of the climate and of the sea air and natural ventilation and how high they're built and all of this. So there are some tall buildings there, which is quite surprising because there's no such thing in places like Fiji outside of hotels. There are tall office buildings and apartment buildings and such, but none of them are too tall necessarily, and they're all highly structured to both position themselves in regard to the sun and the sea breezes, etc. Obviously, there is a huge teeming life around the coasts and marinas, which Noumea is surrounded by water. It is on the water, and so there are lots of marinas, as our boat was moored at. And these marinas and these boats have this incredible yachting life. There is so many yachts and sailing ships around the huge lagoon that Noumea has, to the point that my father remarked that he wasn't sure he'd ever seen so many sailing boats in one small place. He's been to many, many ports in his life, but often the amount of motor yachts as opposed to actual sailing boats is greater. Here there are a lot of sailing boats, so there's a real yachty culture.
Okay.
And the French are really into yachting. They're hugely into yachting, so that comes partly from the French vibe. Then you've got an astonishing piece of architecture, if that's your game, which must not be missed. And intriguingly, it is down in the guidebooks of things to do, because I don't know why. Maybe it doesn't seem, for want of a better word, touristy at the outset, but there is an astonishing cultural center called and I hope I pronounce this right because the first three letters are TJI, so I'll just say Tibau Cultural Center, which was designed by the famed Italian architect Renzo Piano. And I would suspect that this place cost $60 million, if not $100 million, paid for by the French government to make a big impression after there was some civil unrest in the early 90s, I believe. And just to Google it and see it from photos will make you want to see it up close.
Yeah, that's quite a stunning piece of architecture there. It looks like a half-woven basket is the closest description I can get to it, standing very upright and pointing with jagged fronds at the sky.
And there are something like 8 or 9 or 12 of those representing each of the main tribes of New Caledonia, indigenous tribes of New Caledonia. And they are all crafted using old systems. I believe maybe they're all interlock and there aren't nuts and bolts or something like this. Like the level of detail in its construction is phenomenal. If you're at all into architecture, it is it's almost worth going to this place just for this place.
Okay. And this is the Jean-Marie Tibau, when we don't know how to say that word, cultural center. And I assume we're going there to gawk at it, but there are also activities on there that help us understand the Kanak people?
Yes, absolutely. It's a Kanak or Malaysian cultural center. And so within it, there are all sorts of different exhibits that also correspond to the different tribes of the Kanak culture. So it's quite detailed. It is not the world's largest museum on the inside, but the inside will give you something to do outside of the astonishing architecture. There's also an incredibly well-constructed, very, very detailed bushwalk around the museum that is highly specific and dotted with outdoor sculptures. And I was not able to take the audio tour when I was there because it was a holiday or a Sunday or a day when that wasn't operational. But I think there's something like 80 exhibits along the way. So if you want to do it properly and take the audio tour and take this elongated stroll and stop at everything, you can really spend a day or two at this place.
Okay.
Sundays, by the way, just mentioning that, Sundays are refreshingly closed. Everywhere is closed on a Sunday, which is nice and old school.
So that'd be similar to Fijian culture where Sunday's still an important day.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so. I haven't been to Fiji on a Sunday in a while. So shops, et cetera, closed. In fact, I think we went to the cultural center on a Sunday, and so it was open to go through, and they'll still take your money at the door. Not that expensive, but a whole lot of the exhibits were closed, and you had to look at them through the glass windows.
Okay. What else would you recommend that we do here in New Caledonia?
It's very geared towards its beaches. So if that is your thing, you want to enjoy being on the beach. There are beautiful, beautiful, beautiful beaches, and they've got a very unique vibe. In a way, this is where the clash of French and Kanak culture, or France and the South Pacific, comes into a nice focus, because the beaches are like tiny little microcosms of the Côte d'Azur.
Okay.
Like along Caen towards Monaco, all those beautiful towns, because there's the beach and then there's a promenade that is evocative of walking along the promenade along Caen. And then there's a road, and then behind that is the shops and the restaurants and the bars and so forth, and the hotels. So it's like a South Pacific tiny version of the Côte d'Azur, but the beaches are 100,000 times better. If your listeners have ever been to those European beaches along the Côte d'Azur, they're actually terrible beaches.
Terrible beaches.
They're terrible. They're rocks. They're stones.
Yeah, the stones is probably, Nice, for instance, is just fist-sized stones, yeah.
Yeah, Nice is fist-sized stones. It's terrible. And also, you can't even walk along it as you wish. Every now and then you've got to go up and get on the promenade because the hotels all have these private beaches in front of them. And so it's not even good for a stroll because you're constantly interrupted by the idea of ownership. And all of the beaches in New Caledonia all are public. So you can just walk along them to the heart's content. And I am not a windsurfer, but you see windsurfers everywhere there. And I guess for the same reason that the sailors love it, windsurfers love it. They make it a destination to go there because supposedly the winds around New Caledonia make windsurfing there an absolute dream. It is a windsurfer's destination paradise.
And to me, if sailors and windsurfers love it, we're probably talking about a fairly constant breeze.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Which is very important too, because in the South Pacific, the general temperature is hot, and so that breeze is vital. Also, I should say for your listeners who have been to places such as Fiji and found the heat oppressive, they might have found the heat oppressive in Fiji because of the humidity. And one of the best things I found about New Caledonia was that it is a much drier heat. It is much less humid. So even though it's hot, it is much more tolerable because it's not humid.
Okay. And you mentioned the beaches, but you didn't say your favorite beach.
So the two main beaches that are very easy to get to, that are basically in the main city of Noumea, Anse Vata Beach and the Plage de la Baie des Citrons, Lemon Beach.
Okay.
or Beach of the Bay of Lemons. Beach of the Bay of Lemons. Of those two, just push a little further on, just walk an additional 10 or 15 minutes and get to Anse Vata Beach. It is nicer than Plage de la Baie des Citrons by a magnitude of 30%, I would suggest. And that is almost simply because the Lemon Beach is the first one you get to. And if you just go a little further, the Anse Vata is as good, less crowded, slightly more upscale bars and restaurants. And I even noticed, we weren't off a cruise ship, and I noticed that the cruise ship trolley bus and the cruise ship buses that you can hop on, I guess, is included in your cruise ship. They don't take you to Anse Vata. They take you to the lemon one, Plage de la Baie des Citrons, and they let you off there, and then you have your lunch and you get back on, you go back to the cruise ship. And so that is obviously design.
Yep.
The businesses at the Citron cater to the cruise ship. If you want to do your own thing, go to Anse Vata. Then there is another beach in New Caledonia that is much more out of the way. And by that, I still only mean 20-minute drive in a car, and taxis are cheap. I don't know if they're Uber, but it's called Kendu Beach. And that is much more locals, no tourists probably, when you go there, and you'll find something just a little different and very, very beautiful. No real facilities there. Maybe one hotel there with a bar, but not a range of restaurants and bars. So if you go to that one, you're going there to actually sit on the beach and swim in the water, not to sit somewhere and have a beer and look at the water.
Well, and we should say, when we talk about beaches, we're really focusing on the region in this podcast around the capital city of Noumea. The whole island, the main island, I should say, of New Caledonia is about 200 miles long, if I have got this correct. So
yes,
it's twice the length of Long Island. So I am sure there are, if you want to really find the secluded beach, then you need to hire a car and go a little further away, and you're going to find something that's more like that secluded Fijian beach. But we're looking at this more urban part of New Caledonia.
Yes, and I'm sure that there would be hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of little beaches scattered all up and down the coast, because once you Google it and look at a map of New Caledonia, you'll see that the whole thing is practically coast. It's incredibly long and thin rather than, for example, Australia or the United States, which is could almost push it out into a circle quite easily. This is really long and thin, so there's much more coast than inland, and so there are beaches everywhere.
Right, 200 miles long and about 20 miles wide. So
it's kind of like Vietnam if Vietnam was surrounded by water. Now, I should also say that if you are lucky enough to be there as a sailor, there are hundreds of islands, I believe, that are part of New Caledonia, and just sailing around, some of them are really, really close. You can get to them, and they are all fantastic. Incredible beaches, incredible swimming water, beautiful vegetation, and this is, once again, the French influence and a massive difference between New Caledonia and, for example, I keep going back to places like Tonga, Fiji, Vanuatu, etc. All of these beaches you go to, they're pristine and gorgeous, but they've also got things like signage and occasionally toilets, and they've got emergency numbers to call, and they've got cell phone reception. Because I understand that essentially France's commitment to the French unique collectivity, in other words, to all its other offshoots, is that you've got to get there what you get in France. The idea being that, for example, if you live in Paris and you go to a park, you can rightly assume that you are going to get cell phone coverage in that park. And so therefore, when you go to an island in New Caledonia, even if there's nothing else there, it is considered a public park of France, and so you will get cell phone reception because it has to be the equivalent to a park in Paris. Likewise, for example, my girlfriend and I have our small daughter, who I've mentioned before. We took her to the best playground we've ever taken her to in the world. It was huge and massive, and we've been to a lot of playgrounds, and it had Wi-Fi, and we were astonished because any place that is essentially a government-run space, such as a public playground, has Wi-Fi there, which is unusual to say the least for islands in the South Pacific.
Interesting. Let's continue on with the itinerary in terms of what you would recommend we do or see while we're in New Caledonia.
The thing about traveling to islands, such as the islands in the South Pacific, is that you aren't going to a European city with 600 years of culture. So you're not going for cathedrals, museums, etc. I've said that basically the one main museum there that is worth seeing. What you're really going is for the natural resources, the beaches, the astonishing vegetation, the water, the weather, and once again, this thing that is unique in my entire experience of a life of being very well traveled, which is this incredible confluence of deep European culture and cultural norms with a palm tree laden paradise.
Okay.
In terms of eating and drinking, once again, the French cultural influence is very, very heavy here. And so, as I said, you might go to a breakfast place and get traditional French breakfast. You'll see right there on the menu your croque madame, your croque monsieur, your pain au chocolat. Also, this will extend to the concept of eating that is established in the French cultural culinary tradition. So big lunch is a big thing. If you want to have a big lunch, all of the restaurants around cater to that. They all have the same opening and closing times that is traditional in France. So you've traditionally got a restaurant open, I believe it's from 11:30 to 2, and then it will close again till 5. There's none of this sort of popping in and having a quote unquote proper cooked meal at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. That is not the French way, and therefore that is not the New Caledonian way. And also you've got fine dining in the French style at a number of restaurants, which is absolutely unusual for this part of the world. Not for places like Australia, obviously, and not for the hotels in Fiji, the expensive hotels, but in terms of just restaurants that aren't connected to hotels, just being French service, white tablecloth, fine dining restaurants, they are in Noumea, and you can absolutely partake of those. And the food, you can get your steak tartare and all your traditional French food. So that's really interesting. Now, on the flip side of that, you can also eat Kanak. You can eat Malaysian, obviously. There's Malaysian restaurants around and Kanak-run businesses. speaking French, but serving more traditional food. And there is also an enormous amount of my particular favorite cuisine of the world, which is Vietnamese food. There is a large Vietnamese population in New Caledonia, proportionally, that is. It's the whole place hasn't got a lot of people, but there is a large Vietnamese population, as befits Vietnam's troubled relationship with France. And so they've brought their cooking. So I had some exceptional Vietnamese, bizarrely enough, in New Caledonia.
And are there particular restaurants or restaurant areas that you would recommend?
Yeah, the restaurants that the cruise ships, buses will take you to, as I say, the Lemon Bay, are probably going to ultimately give you the most variety, but might not be the actual best restaurants. Mm-hmm. If you continue around to the next beach, as I said, my favorite one, Ansa Vata Beach, that has a better range of restaurants, and you can tell that the locals eat there more, because I spotted locals that I'd spotted in other places there. Mm-hmm. And that's where you'll find more Vietnamese restaurants as well. And there's nothing there that's particularly tacky. There were a couple of restaurants that just bordered on the touristy tacky. I mean, the whole place is very civilized and very classy, very much so. But it's less geared towards Northern Hemisphere tourists than the first beach. Now, I have neglected to mention something that must go on your itinerary. The very first thing you must do, and in fact, kind of outside of the cultural center that I've mentioned before, and just walking around and seeing the downtown and all the different beaches, the best thing to do is to wake up nice and early and go to the market, which is every single day except Sunday. And even on Sunday, the fish market area of the market is still available. And the fishermen obviously are bringing in their fish all the time. The market is exceptional. It's right there down on the water in Noumea. It's a port city, and there is all sorts of fantastic food to be had there. So you've got your fishes and your meats and all of this stuff, your fruits and your vegetables, but it's also dotted with places to eat. So we found a fantastic place. It was in the French style, so it's counter and you can eat standing up or just have a little coffee standing up, and it's essentially a hexagon and the kitchen is in the center of the hexagon. So you've got all your customers standing around the thing, like a bar, really. And that is massively entertaining because you're surrounded by fishmongers and life and floral merchants and all of this. There's also arts and crafts available at the market. And there's also a more traditional market that's kind of shoved into a very pretty but parking lot nonetheless, where you can buy more touristy things such as T-shirts. But the market itself is very authentic. It's where the locals go to shop, and it is the fresh fish. It is all of that good stuff. Dotted around there inside as well, in terms of places to eat, are creperies.
Of course.
Being from France, there are creperies, and so everyone is walking around with crepe. It is very easy to find a creperie and get a very, very inexpensive crepe and walk around and eat it.
Now, are there fusion foods like crepes with Malaysian food inside, or is it a strict boundary that the French food is French food and then the Malaysian or the Vietnamese food is separate?
Once you step outside of the French concept, you will get all sorts of wonderful fusion. Okay. And especially in this part of the world, Asian cultures have combined in fascinating ways. Mm-hmm. And you can find Malaysian and Asian fusion food, absolutely. French people are very, very conservative in their culinary traditions, and the French people that settled in other places tended to be more conservative, and I would dare say that so have their descendants. So no, in terms of the French stuff, it is traditional and conservative French food, that's good food, but you won't find the beefsteak mixing it up with a Malaysian influence. Okay. Now, I should mention this about New Caledonia, which is also interesting. I mean, travelers come in all shapes and sizes, and people might be interested in why certain places might be able to economically survive or be wealthier than their neighbors, etc. New Caledonia, like Texas or Kuwait or Venezuela with their oil, New Caledonia has nickel. And it not only has nickel, it has 25% of the world's nickel.
Huh.
So even if late next year, when the referendum comes, even if the Malaysian movement declares independence and France stops building roads and takes all their money away from New Caledonia will still have this tremendous income supply of nickel. 25% for a tiny island in the South Pacific, that's incredible. I mean, talk about being lucky with your mineral deposits. And my suggestion is that it's only going to get richer because nickel is used in batteries. And as the world moves towards more and more battery use and needs more nickel batteries, you're going to get a quarter of that nickel from New Caledonia.
Interesting.
It's more in danger of the rising seas that are coming than any sort of economic collapse, even if France pulls all its money out, which it will do overnight if the place becomes independent.
In terms of rising seas, though, we're not talking about an island like some of the ones in the Indian Ocean that the highest point is 10 feet above sea level. This is a place that has interior mountains.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It has huge interior mountains. In fact, running down the entire center of the long, elongated country like a spine is a mountain range. Mm-hmm. No, I'm just talking in general in terms of any island nation. All the island nations are concerned about flooding, some in the next 10 years, some in the next 50, but they're all concerned about it and they're all doing things about it.
Right.
There is also tsunami warnings that you can check because around the island and scattered throughout the South Pacific, there's almost constant earthquakes going on underneath the sea. Mm-hmm. And so these create minor tsunamis. There was a very, very large 7.0 earthquake off the east coast of New Caledonia a day before we left that gave us pause and we checked it out. But there has been no actual major tsunami action in New Caledonia because of these earthquakes for ages and ages, partly just through luck of its geography. There are a whole bunch of islands to its east, I believe, the Loyalty Islands that kind of block that stuff.
Oh, okay.
There's no reason to fear going there, but you will read, if you Google New Caledonia natural disasters or something, you will read about the fact that earthquakes occur throughout the South Pacific and therefore around New Caledonia, down on the ocean bed with great regularity.
Okay. The one thing we didn't ask, or I didn't ask earlier, was in terms of when you were there. I'm looking at their weather, and they have a hot season and a drier season. You were there at what month?
I was there about 4 weeks ago. I was there, I guess, at the beginning of November, and the weather was magical.
Okay. What I'm reading is that the hot season, when it's hotter and more humid, is December to March.
That makes sense to me. It felt to me like we were at the beginning of a hot season. So it was comfortable heat. It was lovely heat. It was nice warm, but it wasn't oppressive. I did get sunburnt on an island. I went for a run around an island, one of those beautiful, pristine islands just out there with nothing on it. Mm-hmm. And it was the first time I've got sunburnt in 2 decades, and I was really angry at myself. I made a rookie mistake of running around at noon without sunscreen on for only half an hour. But you see, I got fooled because of the lovely breezes and because it's not humid there. Mm-hmm. It didn't feel as hot as an equivalent temperature day would feel even in Sydney. So I got fooled, and that was a mistake. So if you're prone to that sort of thing, if you're in the South Pacific, you should be wearing sunscreen any day anyway, every day anyway.
Well, and what I'm reading is that the dry season, least amount of rains, and is that September to December season that you were there. So good going.
I'll tell you about the dry season. It had been very, very dry in the months leading up to when we were there. And it's astonishing when you go to a place where the natural world is so much in constant evidence everywhere you turn your eyes, that how dry it had become visually. And just driving around the island, just on the outskirts of Noumea, seeing vast stretches of land that it was by no means dead. I mean, living, properly functioning, breathing flora and fauna, but that had this dry yellowness to it because it needed the rain. And that's what the dry season can do to a place like this visually.
Okay. Well, it sounds like we're kind of wrapping up in terms of itineraries. Anything else you want to add before we get to some of our wrap-up questions?
Nope.
Okay. You're standing in the prettiest spot that you saw in New Caledonia? Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I guess the prettiest place I stood in New Caledonia was just above Ansa Vata Beach. There was a creperie / restaurant there. I think it's called La Rochette. I'm not entirely convinced of that, but it's up behind a disused hotel. So it's on a minor hill, and the outlook there encompassing Ansa Vata Beach and the rest of the coastline that you can see in either direction, 270-degree views, was astonishing. And what you're looking at is, according to New Caledonian information, it's the world's largest lagoon. I guess there is one rival to that claim who will claim that they've got the world's largest lagoon, but it is either the world's largest or the world's second largest lagoon. And so that gives the water and the coastline a particular magnificence because it is unruined or uncorrupted by too many currents and waves and rips and all of that stuff. So it really, even people who've seen a lot of gorgeous turquoise water in their lives, people who've been to beaches in Honolulu, even who've been to places like Fiji, this water is astonishing in its clarity and turquoise color and brilliance.
Okay. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in New Caledonia.
One thing that made me laugh with an intriguing edge, a sort of, a black comedy laugh, was the fact that on our boat we were displaying the French flag and the Kanak flag. As any of your listeners know who travel by sea, it's traditional to fly the flag of the place where you are at port. And we flew both flags, seeing that that was the appropriate thing. And an obvious French settler descendant came by and gave us an earful and said that we shouldn't be displaying the Kanak flag, that we were in France. And it is that sort of bittersweet comedy of the French taking the place very, very seriously, the fact that they are in France. And so therefore the only flag that should be flown is the French flag. And indeed, it is kind of funny when you see signs around that say France and just see the French flag, because this place makes no differentiation through the French prism of things that it is not essentially a suburb of Paris. So I know that's not hysterical, but
That's all right. And
I do remember seeing a couple of things out jogging that really made me laugh. And sorry, they're not coming to my head at the moment. I should have made notes.
And then last question, you had to summarize New Caledonia in 3 words. What 3 words would you use?
I'm going to give you a few and you can pick one, I suppose. Paris in paradise, or France without Parisians. France on the beach, or...
I like France on the beach. Okay. Excellent. Our guest again has been CJ Johnson. And CJ, you don't have a travel podcast, but you do have a MOVIELAND podcast. So I'm guessing that if we want to learn more about movies, that's when we should give it a listen.
I took your website's name at its face value. I am an amateur traveler. I don't do any travel writing or travel podcasting professionally, but I do professionally podcast as a film critic here in Australia for the ABC. And so if you want to listen to any of my hundreds and hundreds of episodes, they're all available free on iTunes. MOVIELAND, all one word.
Or Apple Podcasts, as they prefer for us to say these days. But excellent. CJ, thanks so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your obvious love for New Caledonia.
Merci beaucoup, Chris. Au revoir.
Très bien. In news of the community, as I said, we are going to announce on this show the details of the trip next year, 2017, and that is a trip the first week of September to Prague and Krakow and Budapest. And the details for that trip are now up on the website at amateurtraveler.com/Europe 2018. And you go check out the details for that trip. If you're interested in joining us for more of the discussion about that trip, join the Facebook group. Go to amateurtraveler.com/trips. Special thanks to Spencer Kwong, former guest on the show, for a contribution to the show. We've had some questions about opening up a Patreon account so that people can support the show. I've been hesitant to do it because I feel like if I do it and nobody's interested, I would get so discouraged I would quit doing the show. But if you're interested in that, just let me know. I heard this week from Mike, who said loved the U.S. UNESCO World Heritage Sites podcast with Gary the first time around, and it was a delight to listen to it again today. One of the best you've done. It would have been nice to hear a short update at the end on the status of what were the proposed sites and possible new proposed sites. Also, on a different but somewhat related note, I know that Gary has been to really remote and difficult to access national parks in Alaska, Kobach, Gates of the Arctic, Lake Clark, and Katmai. I'd love to hear him discuss these parks and also describe the logistics of making travel to them happen. Thanks for all the great work you do. Let's do that in the opposite order. I told Mike I probably won't do a show on, we're talking about some national parks that get maybe 100 visitors a year or something on that order of magnitude. Probably won't do a show on that because it's so niche. I like doing some of the remote destinations, but don't tend to want to do something that's so remote that most of you are never going to get there. So that we'll save that for Gary. Gary's got a new podcast out there, although his, I think, is delving into the history of the place. In terms of tentative sites, a number of sites have just been added to the list that the U.S. is proposing. Not all of these will become UNESCO World Heritage Sites. In fact, most of them probably won't. But they include Big Bend National Park in Texas, the Brooklyn Bridge, Central Park, the California Current Conservation Complex that includes the Monterey Bay National Maritime Sanctuaries as well as the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, the Civil Rights Movement sites, some of the Baptist churches that were involved, the Dexter Street Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, the Bethel Baptist Church, and the 16th Street Baptist Church, the Dayton Aviation sites, the Huffman Prairie Flying Field, the Wright Cycle Company, and the Wright and Wright Printing, early Chicago skyscrapers, a number of sites there in Chicago, Ellis Island, key works of modern architecture by Frank Lloyd Wright, as well as the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks, so that would be in Native American site, the Marianas Trench National Monument, and the marine protected areas of American Samoa, as well as Moravian church settlements in the Moravian Bethlehem district of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Interesting thing there for me is my daughter went to school in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and I went to school in Troy, New York, and also an alumni of RPI in Troy, New York, was one of the Roeblings, the son of the father-son team that built the Brooklyn Bridge. So a couple connections there to those two sites for us. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.